having to change their party's stance on the 47% forcible rape or self-deportation. It works like this. If you can't win the game, change the rules. At present, Michigan Republicans are trying to change election laws so that a presidential candidate would receive electoral votes based on each district won instead of based on the overall popular vote in the state. The strategy? Large pockets of typically Democratic voters, including minorities in urban areas, would therefore have weakened influence. They would only help Democrats win electoral votes in specific districts. How would such electoral rigging have changed the outcome last November? Instead of an Obama victory of 332 to 206, Mitt Romney would be president with 273 votes to Obama's 262. Even though President Obama won more than 3 million more votes than Mitt Romney, under this proposed system, he would have lost the election. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell shot down a similar proposal in his state last week, but Michigan Governor Rick Snyder says he's open to the idea. In Republican state houses, a new motto, perhaps: if at first you don't succeed, cheat. Joining the panel now is president of the Brennan Center for Justice, Michael Waldman. Michael, every time you are on this program, there's a new outrage. This is the most outrageous of them.
I deny any connection to making that happen. This is the kind of thing that gives opportunism a bad name.
Yes, yes, to say the least.
I'm no fan of the Electoral College. I think we ought to have a national popular vote where everybody's vote counts equally. But this is so much worse than what we have now. As you say, this would make it so that whoever wins a congressional district gets that electoral vote. But the fact is, Democrats, liberals, especially racial minorities, tend to be in cities or near cities, and this would wind up meaning that their votes count less. It would certainly violate, I think, the Voting Rights Act by diluting the votes of racial minorities, and it would lock into place the gerrymandering, which the Republicans did it this time. The Democrats do it some other time. It would, if you could find a way to make the electoral system more unfair, just based on who lost an election,
and to disenfranchise minority voters even more. I mean, to some degree, I read about this, Karen, and it's like it was sort of inevitable that it would get to this point, right? I mean, this is already happening in congressional districts. In fact, Democrats in House races won more than 500,000 more votes than Republicans in 2012. Republicans own the House. So it was only a matter of time before that kind of gerrymandering made its way to the presidential stage.
You know, in some ways, I was thinking you got to give the GOP credit. They got started very early this time, whereas voter ID took them, those laws, you know, they took a few months after the last election. This time they were on it, right? I mean, the thing that I hope people recognize, well, on the one hand, we were just talking about immigration reform, right? They're trying to say, we need the Latino vote. How can we reach out to, you know, African Americans
and minorities?
And yet, so they're saying that over here while they're saying, okay, but how are we going to make sure that we dilute the power of those votes just in case this stuff doesn't work?
What's interesting, and Michael, we talked about this briefly before we started this segment, is when you had something like the voter ID laws, which were also outrageous on the scale of outrage, they probably tally somewhere around this. That ended up incentivizing, I think, a lot of voters to come out to the polls because they felt like their right to vote was being threatened. So something like this could actually work have an opposite effect.
Well, with the voter ID and other laws, first of all, courts stepped in to block them.
Right.
But voters, especially minority voters, especially African-American voters, they noticed. They got really mad and they turned out in larger numbers than they might have otherwise. Here, one of the interesting things is in Pennsylvania 4 years ago, one of the Republican legislators tried to do this then. And it was blocked by other Republican lawmakers because they realized that this might cause their districts to be targeted for voter turnout efforts. And you could see, if this, in the unlikely event that this were to happen, this would be the election issue for the next governorship race, for the next legislative race. It would be seen as a really inappropriate, illegitimate effort to rig the rules. And, you know, I think that they'll back down probably for that very reason.
This does seem to be, again, dividing the Republican side into the Yahoo caucus and the non-Yahoo caucus. Those are highly technical terms, mind you. And because you do, right away, there were a couple state state senators in Virginia, Republicans, who came out and said, we're not going to go for that. And
Bob McDonnell.
And Bob McDonnell has come out.
He's in the Yahoo caucus.
And I think,
right. But he's sort of got, maybe that math wouldn't
He's trying to
work.
move. He's trying to have a foot in each caucus, perhaps. And so I think it is so outrageous, even more so than voter ID issues, that it's bringing so much attention to them. And it just seems wrong. When they tried to do this last summer for this current election, the last election in Pennsylvania, you had one state senator proposed it, and a lot of Republicans came out and said no. So they still have a ways to go to get ahead of steam behind this effort.
But the politics of this are horrible
right.
for state legislators who have awful state budgets. I mean, a lot of their state budgets are underwater. Governors in some of these states are up for re-election, not Bob McDonnell, but in Pennsylvania, the governor's up for re-election. In Florida, the governor's up for re-election. So the more that governors and state legislatures and state lawmakers are focusing on things like this and not the economy and jobs, the worse off it is for them.
You're starting to see, interestingly, a bit of a pullback by some of the Republicans, even on these democracy issues, even on voting. So Governor Rick Scott in Florida, who was behind the laws that made it impossible for that well-known radical sect, the League of Women Voters of Florida,
to voter registration drives.
They were behind those laws, which were blocked by the courts. Now Rick Scott has come in and said, you know what, we need to expand early voting. We need to go a different way, because he knows that the voters actually will vote based on this. And this is what I hope is a potential glimmer of possibility for something to move forward. President Obama, in his inaugural address and on election night, said we need to do something about the way we run elections.
Indeed we do.
That's a chance the country ought to try to take, because not to rig the game, but to take kind of common sense steps to modernize voter registration.
And gerrymandering happens
sort of
on both sides of the aisle, which is another reason this is a flawed strategy, because there could be a Democratic governor that takes over and flips the script.
Michael, you and I have talked about this. I think part of what needs to happen is that on the left, we need to reframe this argument around our constitutional rights, right? Because, we're having this conversation about gun rights as a constitutional right and all the reasons why we shouldn't make it harder to own a gun or give somebody a gun, and yet we're accepting all kinds of new restrictions to make it harder for people to vote. And again, I think if we couch this in that, the Constitution and the constitutional rights that we're talking about, and erring on the side of protecting the individual, I hope we can reframe the conversation.
What helps your effort in that way is, as the Republicans go more Yahoo, more outrageous, it really delegitimizes them if they try to make any more nuanced or subtle runs at voter ID or registration issues. It just shows that they're out to cheat. And it also, I don't think these governors, particularly those who are up for re-election in off years, want to bring national attention to them. They will do better with a smaller electorate, a lot of these Republicans running for re-election. They go into this too deep, and it will become a national issue, and